Hi, this is part 2 of my video on citing basics with a focus on Chicago or Turabian style. And in part 2, we're going to talk about bibliographies. Recall in part 1, the key idea is that you must always cite information as you're using it. In Chicago, we use footnotes, and those footnotes need to appear throughout your paper each time you use information from a source. The exception essentially is if information in multiple sentences in a row all comes from the same source and the same part of the source, then you just put the footnote at the end of that information. But you do need at least one footnote in each paragraph of your writing, except potentially for an introduction or conclusion, if that is entirely your own thoughts and ideas and doesn't use any outside information. But now we're going to talk about bibliographies, which are also required. If you learned about MLA format or APA format in, say, an English course, you learned about works cited pages or references pages, that is essentially what Chicago calls a bibliography. Bibliographies have very specific requirements. Your library's website gives information about Chicago style. Look there for details. Remember, it might be under Chicago. It might be under CMOS for Chicago Manual of Style. It might also even be under Turabian, but here are some general guidelines that will hopefully help you as well. First of all, you may have occasionally in a course been told in a bibliography, include every source you've looked at, even if you haven't used it in your paper. Don't do that for my courses, and generally don't do that. Every footnote in your paper has to tie to an entry in your bibliography. Of course, multiple footnotes might all tie to the same source, and that's fine. Every source is in your bibliography just once, of course. Additionally, if something is in your bibliography, it needs to be footnoted in your paper. Bibliography entries are alphabetized by the last name of the first listed author. If there's no author given, use the first word of the title. Ignore initial A, an, or the. And bibliography entries provide full publication information so others can easily find the source material. So here's what a book reference looks like. So this first one is the book that I used as an example for footnotes in the previous video. Notice that for bibliography, it is last name first, but only for the first author listed. If there's multiple authors, the other authors are in regular order. Where footnotes separate items with commas, in bibliographies, they are separated with period. So we have Beale, period. Title of the book, period. 4th edition, period. Notice there aren't parentheses around the publication information. And notice the page number isn't there. Page numbers are used in footnotes, but they're not used for bibliographies for books. Now for articles, there are 3 more or less main types of articles: journals, magazines, and newspapers. Most academic writing strongly prefers journal articles, what we often call scholarly sources. Magazines are seldom used, but they are cited similarly. Newspapers are used a lot in history, but the newspapers that are used aren't modern newspapers. They aren't like yesterday's newspaper or this year's newspaper. They are newspapers from the time period you're writing about. So if you're writing an article about World War II, you might look up newspapers from the 1940s. If you're writing about the American Civil War, same thing. Look up newspapers from that time period. So what is a journal? I just want to mention this briefly. A journal, when we talk about citing a journal, we don't mean journal like a person's diary. That's not what's meant here. A journal is a specialized scholarly publication. It's not something you could usually buy at a local bookstore. For a bunch of reasons. They are typically purchased by researchers, by professors in that specific field or even subfield, or by university libraries. They are highly specialized. They are scholarly. You aren't going to see lots of advertisements or sometimes any advertisements in them because they are paid for through their subscriptions only. They are usually peer reviewed, and what that means is that If an author of a magazine article or a newspaper article submits an article, their editor might look at it. Maybe more than one editor will look at it, but they aren't looked at by experts in the field. So if I were to submit an article to the American Historical Review, which is the major journal for history, about, say, the American Civil War, that article would be reviewed by people who are experts in that field. If I were to submit an article about the history of 17th century China, that article would be reviewed by people who are experts in that field. That's what we mean by peer reviewed. Peer review is usually a blind process, and that means that the person reviewing it does not know who the author is. That's designed to be to be fairer, right? So that if my friend is reviewing my article, they don't know that I'm the person who wrote it. Or conversely, my enemy, if they're reviewing the article, they don't know that I'm the person who wrote it. Okay. A journal, in addition to its title, also includes a volume number. This is basically how long the journal has been published. So like volume 25 means that it's the 25th year of publication. Volume 2 means it's the second year of publication. Volume is followed by number. And usually, not always, but usually. And number is the number of the issue published that year or in that volume. So for example, if you saw volume 10, number 2, that means that journal has been published for 10 years, and that particular issue is the second issue of year 10 of the journal. In Chicago, we always abbreviate number, NO period, for footnotes and bibliographies. Not in the text of a paper, but in a footnote or bibliography, we always abbreviate the number of a journal as lowercase NO period. That I know it's capitalized here, but it wouldn't be in a bibliography entry. If you're using a web page, you want the author. If there's no author, use the sponsoring organization, the date. It might be the date that you accessed it if there's no date available, and the title of the website, of the web page rather. In general, in scholarly writing and history writing and academic writing, we don't want you to use stuff you found on websites. Now, it may be in some courses that you've actually been given materials to be used. That's fine. But what we usually strongly discourage writers from doing is going and doing a Google search because the sources you find might be accurate, but they probably aren't scholarly. And part of writing history in college is interacting with scholarly sources. Here's some examples. So the first 3 are all journal articles. So we have the author's name, a last name first, the title of the article in quotation marks, the title of the journal in italics, and then not italicized and no punctuation before it, the volume. So this means this is the 31st year of publication, and it's the 4th issue of that year. The year is in parentheses afterwards. If there's a month given, you could put the month in front of the year. So if this were April 1980 or August 1980, you would write out April or August. And then the entire page range goes here. So for the footnote, only the page that you used is used in the footnote. The bibliography includes the entire page range of the article. And you can look at the other, you can pause and look at the other examples if you want to. This one is a website. This does have an author. This is this writer and historian's vita. A vita is what a literally means life in Latin, but it is what college professors use instead of resumes usually. They tend to be quite longer. While resume might be 1 or 2 pages at most, a vita might be 8 or 9 pages for someone who is early in their career, relatively speaking, and much longer for someone who has been a professor for a long time. Please make sure in your bibliographies that you don't just give a URL. It's good to include the URL so that the person reading can find the source, but it should not be used alone. You always need names and dates as well. So if there's no date given for the material, you can put the date that you accessed it, like I did here for a website. Some formatting issues. This is a little tricky, and I personally am not picky in general about several of these things. The one thing I'm picky about that I want you to do is to alphabetize by author's last name, because you should be able to do that. Other things that I'm less picky about, but that Word should be able to do relatively easily. Entries should have hanging indents, so it's like the opposite of a paragraph. In a paragraph, we indent the first line. In a bibliography entry, we don't indent the first line, but we indent every other line. Don't do that by hand. Have Word do it for you. Bibliographies are supposed to be single-spaced with an extra line between each entry. Ideally, you're going to have separate sections for primary and secondary sources. And you may only have, one or two primary sources listed. That's fine. You can still have a separate section for it. If you use the same author twice, the second time that their name appears, put 6 hyphens instead of their name. And so I'm going to give you an example here of what this looks like. I'm just going to show you my working bibliography that for a project I'm working on right now. So this is a bibliography for my dissertation. It's obviously much longer than your bibliography is going to be. But I just want to point this out of what it looks like. Notice that everything in here has hanging indents, and it's all single spaced with extra lines between each entry. And notice how I have one section, my first section is called primary sources. Those always go first in history. And then that's followed by secondary sources. You see here, for example, I have multiple works by this author. So for the other times I've used their work, I've put 6 hyphens instead of their name. So just a quick example of the general formatting for bibliography. The word bibliography is at the top of it. It is centered. I think it should be bolded. I honestly have seen it both ways in sources that I've looked at, so I'm not 100% sure what Chicago wants. If it were me, I would bold it. And then annotated bibliographies. I do want to mention this because I see this error made sometimes. A bibliography should only have annotations. An annotation is usually a summary of the source and an evaluation of the source. So what is the source saying? How valuable and relevant is it to your paper? Only do that if an assignment asks for it. Otherwise, it should not be annotated. Now, oftentimes, for one of your assignments in a history course, you will be required to do an annotated bibliography as part of the process of writing a paper or just as part of the process of studying a topic. If you're doing it as part of the process of writing a paper, the bibliography with your final paper, and even the bibliography for the rough draft of your paper, if you're submitting your rough draft, should not be annotated. Again, unless the assignment instructions say that it should be. If a bibliography is supposed to be annotated, it will say it should be annotated. Finally, I want to talk about automatic citation generators. This is something you will run into when you start using, or if you are using library databases, which in many courses you should be using. Now, in some courses, the sources are curated for you, so you don't have to do that. But in some history courses, you are going to need to use the library databases to find sources. And those databases usually will have a little button that you can click on to generate a citation. And there's a couple of things you want to do. You want to make sure you always choose Chicago and then choose within Chicago Notes Bibliography. Do not choose Author Date. Choose Notes Bibliography instead. And then you obviously copy it, you paste it into your paper in your bibliography. That's a wonderful tool. It's very helpful, but you can't trust it. You still have to edit it because I would say, in my experience, at least a third of the time, probably at least 50% of the time, there are errors in those automatic citations. The most common errors I see is capitalization or italics errors. APA has unique capitalization rules, and sometimes those are just automatically plugged in incorrectly for other formats. In Chicago, we capitalize all important words in a title. So all words other than conjunctions or short prepositions, um, or prep, or probably something I'm forgetting right now, other than conjunctions and most prepositions. I think anyway. Um, and we always in articles we don't capitalize articles the, a, and unless they're the first word of a title. Other times I see titles that are all capital letters. They should not be all capital letters in your bibliography. So same thing. Sometimes the titles of journals aren't italicized correctly, or the titles of books aren't italicized correctly. Um, and there's other errors too. Sometimes you do need to double check. Even authors' names sometimes, especially there's multiple authors, are sometimes messed up. So it's great to use those automatic citation generators. Nothing wrong with using them, but check what they've done to make sure that they're correct. For journal articles, especially, they often only give the first page number, and remember, you need the entire page range. So it's great to use citation generators, but do not rely on them 100%. I hope you find this helpful. Again, you can you can certainly find more information in your library's information section on how to cite. There will be a subsection on Chicago. If you have questions for me, please reach out, and thanks for watching.